I just want to know if I snap my fingers at my computer and my phone, does that magically make it do what I want it to do?
I wish it worked that way.
Waving a magic wand.
I could go like that.
All it does is make sure you
Braden Lawton, come up to the table and join us. We would love to have you.
You have some extra handouts from over there?
Yeah, there's one over here.
The front of the class.
There's one right here.
I like to get mine up because I can't read
Used
it
to do when
straight.
I was in school.
Can make one in Braille for you.
Yeah, could you, and then teach me Braille real quick?
Get your glasses.
Yeah, I got everything else I needed.
All right, so if you want to, go ahead and open to Mark. He's an easy one to find, right? So Mark was interesting. He's a little shorter. We don't have quite as much, but so I'm sure we all know Mark was not one of the original 12 disciples, and it was interesting learning about him. So his Jewish name was John, so that's confusing because there's like 100 of those, right? His Latin surname was Marcus, so he is known as John Mark, all right? We shorten it to Mark. It just says the Gospel of Mark, but his name was kind of technically John Mark. John means Yahweh is gracious. As far as his date, the Lutheran Study Bible is putting him around 50 to 60 AD for when he wrote it. The other sources I looked at are pretty close to that. So somewhere around there. Again, they have to go by a little estimation. I could not find anything about his hometown or his occupation before he wrote his gospel. Before he kind of started following Peter and Paul around. So I couldn't find anything. There is no information about that. His outline in the Lutheran Study Bible is extensive, so I just broke it down into the 4 main headings: a prologue, Jesus' public ministry of preaching and miracle working, then preparing the disciples for passion, death, and resurrection, and then what they call the long ending, which isn't really that long. It's verses 9 through 20. But again, the detail in the outline for him was quite a bit, so that's kind of just the basic outline. So the purpose and audience, basically, again, according to the Study Bible, his purpose was to emphasize the deeds of Jesus. He repeatedly emphasizes the centrality of the Word in the ministry of Jesus and the effect of its authority on men. The themes he kind of focuses around are Jesus as the Son of God. So he does go into some detail describing God's relationship with Jesus. Jesus as a man, in other words, as human. So we see things like his need for quiet time for prayer, his need for sleep, his feelings of compassion, anger, frustration. So Mark kind of emphasizes a little bit of the humanity of Christ. He interestingly emphasizes the hard-heartedness of the disciples and their struggle with faith and understanding. Mark gives the most negative description of Jesus' disciples.
That's because he wasn't one.
That's right. He also goes into a little more detail about clean and unclean according to Old Testament law and rabbinic tradition. And what we'll find out about that is the reason he does that, as you see right below that, is he was primarily writing for a Gentile audience. So again, the Gentiles wouldn't really necessarily have that deeper understanding of, what Jews considered clean and unclean and why there were all those laws and stuff. So the other thing that's interesting too is that we see in Mark this theme of secrecy. We see where Jesus kept telling people, don't say anything to anyone about this. And we're familiar with that, but Mark is the book where we really see that a lot, where Christ said, don't go talking to people about this. Don't spread the word about this. So again, he wrote primarily for a Gentile audience. he seldom refers to the Old Testament, so there's not a ton of like Old Testament references in Mark. And he does explain Jewish things and translates the Aramaic words that Jesus used, and I have those listed a little bit later in the study, so we'll go over those later. So again, he's primarily writing to Gentiles, and he does explain some stuff, but he has some different things in there, like I said, the kind of negative descriptions of the disciples, and Jesus telling people, don't go talk about this right now. So, all right. So one of the things, it's, again, we don't know 100% for sure on a lot of things. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes looking at, like, where was Mark written and things like that. But basically, after consulting probably 3 or 4 different books I found in pastors' shelves, the consensus seems to be that most think that his gospel is primarily based on Peter's teachings. So we know because of several passages, and I have those listed in a minute, that he actually went around with Peter a bit, and he also went with Paul a bit. So while he wasn't one of the eyewitnesses, he spent a lot of time listening to Peter talking about things that Jesus said and did, and he also spent a fair amount of time following Paul. So we know that, like I said, pretty much consensus is that this gospel is written primarily based on Peter's teachings, as well as from Mark's time in Jerusalem. He spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, where he heard these gospel narratives from more than one apostle. So you can guess that, if you spend a lot of time in Jerusalem after the ascension and you're around the disciples a lot, you're going to be hearing that stuff. So that's where most of his stuff is compiled from. One of the sources says, Mark has given us what the discourses of Peter contained. The apostolic authority behind Mark is Peter. And so if we remember that John Mark was kind of an assistant to Peter, then what we're hearing in Mark's gospel is very heavily Peter's teachings. And so that, kind of gives us the background and basis for that. Like I said, he was an assistant to Paul and Barnabas, as well as Peter at different times. They believe he wrote his gospel in Rome while, remember, Peter and Paul were both in prison there, and so they believe that Mark wrote while he was in Rome there. He did write in Greek. After the death of Peter and Paul, ecclesiastical tradition affirms that St. Mark visited Egypt, founded the Church of Alexandria, and died by martyrdom. And I did kind of try to see that in multiple references, and I did find, those traditions held by the early church in multiple places. So we're going to go with that. That most believe that he did go down to Egypt and actually found the church in Alexandria. So, all right, so places where we hear about Mark. 1 Peter 5:13 talks about, this again is written by Peter, and he mentions, blah, 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 sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. And that is a spiritual son, not a biological son. So it's my son in the faith is what he's talking about there. In Acts chapter 12, we see him mentioned, this was when Peter got out of prison. He went to the house of Mary, and this is not Jesus' mother or Mary Magdalene, it's a different Mary. It's Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. And we'll see this in multiple ones. John, whose other's name was Mark. That's kind of, I don't know. Can you imagine being called that? Bobby, whose other name was Laura or something, so anyways, flip in the next page. Same thing, verse 25. John, whose other name was Mark. Acts 13:5, when they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in synagogues of the Jews, and they had John to assist them, and that is this John Mark. And then Acts 15:37, Barnabas and Paul were going someplace, and Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. To which Paul said no, and so Barnabas and Mark ended up going someplace, and Paul, I think, took Silas or someone else with him someplace. So Colossians 4, then we see Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. So Mark was actually related to Barnabas. And then in 2 Timothy 4:11, this is Paul writing, and he says, Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. And so we see Paul asking for Mark to come and visit. So this is the guy, John, whose other's name is Mark. That's why we call him John Mark. All right. Interestingly, Mark records this little verse or two verses that happen right after the betrayal. So right after they find Jesus in the garden, and I think it's actually right after, I'd have to look for sure, Peter cuts the ear off and Jesus heals the ear of the guard. There's these verses that Mark includes, and a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away. Do you guys remember that at all? I mean,
Yeah.
do you? Okay. I thought, wow, I'm not sure I remembered reading that in there. But anyways, it is traditionally believed that was a young John Mark, and that was a young Mark. That he was the young man who had kind of been like following what was going on. And, like we saw in other places, when they thought someone was a disciple, they were like, hey, you're one of the disciples. And the disciples, oh no, I don't know who you're talking about. And they, would try to kind of get out of there because they were afraid. Tradition kind of says that is actually John Mark, who was young. And although they're wondering why he was running around with nothing but a linen cloth on.
He probably just got out of the shower.
That's right.
That's interesting, if he wrote it, he
So-
would specifically put that in there.
Right. But you notice he doesn't say who it was. But he would know about it for sure. So anyways, like I said, tradition says that young man was Mark there. So, all right. In the CPH blog, Saints and Apostles, I found on the internet one of the quotes in there. It is thought to have been, Mark is thought to have been present when Paul was martyred and is considered the founder of the Church of Alexandria. Mark is held as one of Jesus' 72 disciples, and to be the young man who fled at Jesus' arrest. So that was a cross-reference, again, another source showing that, yes, they believe that he was in Rome with Paul and Peter, and then was in Egypt, founded the Church of Alexandria, and like we talked about, was the young man who running around in a linen cloth. All right, couple interesting facts. I kind of mentioned this before. Mark is actually the shortest of the four Gospels. He uses this word immediately, or if you watch Harry Potter a lot, immediately. That's the good English version there. So immediately, or anon, forthwith, by and by, as soon as, shortly, straight away. He uses this term more than 40 times in his gospel. And what that's showing is it's stressing the importance of an event and helps us show that Christ's ministry has a divine purpose and plan behind it. Some of the early manuscripts do not include what's called the long ending in his thing, which is verses 9 through 20 of chapter 16. And if you look in your Bible in 16, most of them actually say that, and they will have those verses in brackets, and it'll say, like, most early manuscripts do not include whatever it is. And so, one of the commentaries I read says, Mark's original composition may have used a suspended ending that left readers wanting to learn more about Jesus and his disciples, the longer ending was probably added later to satisfy people's interests. So he kind of wanted to, like, maybe initially left them on a cliffhanger, but then wrote an ending to it later, so. Oh, here, take that one. And I'll take Yep. So again, that ending, and like I said, in most Bibles, and you'll see, not just in Mark there, but you'll see that in some places, you know, it'll put some stuff in brackets and say, you know, early manuscripts do not include this, or things like that, so. All right, so I thought this was interesting. In Matthew, I found some little fun factoids about some stuff in Matthew. Found a couple of them for Mark. So one of the things we read about is this reclining at the table thing, right? And we're used to hearing that, but how many of you recline at your table at home? And I mean recline. Yep. So what it's talking about is actually reclining, not just, oh, I'm kind of kicking my chair back, but they would actually lie on couches on their left elbow and eat with their right hand. So I dare you to go home and try to lie on your couch on your left elbow and eat with your right hand, or throw some cushions on the floor. Yep, so.
I'd never get up again.
That's right, yeah. I mean, we hear that, but we are all so used to that right there, the Last Supper, where they're all sitting at a table, right? Yeah. But that's not really what it said they were doing. They weren't really sitting in a chair at a table. They were, in fact, kind of reclining like this. And so I wanted to dig into that because I thought, you know, I wonder if, like, medically that helps with digestion or something, you know, if you lay on your side. I mean, I kind of vaguely remember when I was pregnant, they were like, oh, like, sleep on this side, but don't sleep on that side. And I mean, I can't remember what it was, but, you know, I thought, well, what if there's, like, a real reason why lying on your left side maybe, I don't know, helped your stomach or helped with digestion? I mean, your stomach is over there, and I don't know, so.
Ask someone who knows.
Well, I dug around and no. Basically what that is they took on, it was a Greek tradition. And so what happened is, for formal dinners, the couch stretched around three sides of a room, so kind of like this, it was in a U shape. The host took the central place of the U shape, and then the honored guest would be at his side. So the most honored guest would, you know, get the first spot and then on down. And we are familiar with that because, you know, we hear Jesus talk about, you know, sitting at the lowest spot, sitting at the highest spot, that kind of thing. So that's what they did. But then what they had is, so the head was toward the table and the feet toward the wall. This actually was adopted from Greek culture. So the historical and cultural context. Reclining at the table was a dining posture adopted by the elite and free citizens in the Greco-Roman world, symbolizing leisure, freedom, and social status. Unlike the modern practice of sitting upright at a table, diners would recline on couches, resting on their left elbow and eating with their right hand. This arrangement allowed for intimate conversation and fellowship, reflecting the communal nature of meals in antiquity. In Jewish culture, reclining at the table was also a sign of freedom and rest, particularly during the Passover meal. The act of reclining was a reminder of the Israelites' liberation from Egyptian slavery, as free people could dine in a relaxed and leisurely manner.
Weren't their tables also real low to the
Low.
floor? I mean, it
Yep.
wasn't like, you know,
Right.
whatever our standard height
Right.
is. They were only like a foot or
Yeah,
maybe a
they
foot
were
and a
low.
half
Yep.
off the floor also, which would make it a lot, you know, rather than we're down here and you're
Right,
reaching up, not
right.
even knowing what you're grabbing.
Yeah. Yep. So, I don't know. Maybe we should try that sometime at home, right? Put our cushions on the floor, get some little TV trays that are down there.
Don't the Chinese sit down low?
Yep, they do. Yep, a lot of times in Asian cultures, you'll see them sitting on cushions and then having their meal there. So,
Maybe Wednesday night for the chosen, we could just.
we could recline at the table,
Lower
right?
the table, come on Ethan, there's your homework.
We could hook up some
Lower the-
pulleys
lower
on the
table.
sliding.
Right, to get us
To
back
get us
up.
back up again, yeah. Yeah, I think somewhere right along there, a little set of pulleys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or we could do one of those Passover meals again. You guys remember that? We did that with youth group like years ago. We did the Seder meal. We could all recline on cushions and, so yeah, I put a couple pictures in there to kind of show what that might have looked like. And again, there's a lot of different renditions of this, but, so the next time when we read that passage or we hear that reclining at the table, we kind of understand what it was they were doing. Apparently it didn't have anything to do with good digestion or anything. It was a cultural thing that they had adopted from the Greeks, so.
They get full, they go fall asleep.
Yeah, that's true, very convenient, right? Yep, all right, so that's the reclining at the table. The other little interesting thing I found was just a little note about olive oil for lamps. So in New Testament times, they used olive oil in their little lamps that they would have. You know, they usually look like a little,
A genie.
yeah, kind of like that. They're little clay lamps with the little wick, and they had oil in them. So they used olive oil in New Testament times. Apparently, they used animal fat in the Old Testament times. I really don't think whaling was a thing back then. we think about that because that came definitely later. But so this olive oil was very important to them. Hence a lot of references to, like the Mount of Olives and olive pressing and stuff like that. So the first pressing of the olives, the oil was for food, and the second and third pressings are what they used for oil for their lamps, apparently. I thought it was kind of interesting to talk about that because when we're watching The Chosen, one of the things that's kind of just started this episode on Wednesday was Zebedee kind of switching from fishing into getting into the olive oil business. And what they're going to explore is making olive oil because they have apparently a ceremonial press, the right kind of press, and Rhema has information or knowledge of the herbs it takes to make this specific, very, very special anointing oil for the temple. They're gonna kind of set that up as one of the ways the women are helping financially support Jesus' ministry. And so they just introduced that with the episode we watched on Wednesday, is this making of this very special olive oil. So the Mount of Olives, we are familiar with that, and it's mentioned in Mark 13:3. It actually gets its name from the abundance of olive trees that grow there. Shocker, right? The Mount of Olives. And I did not know this, but the word Gethsemane means olive press. So that was,
Oil press?
yeah, oil press. I mean, olive oil, sorry.
Okay.
Well, I mean, they were pressing olives, so I guess it's an olive press.
And
But,
today's olives,
Uh-huh.
right, if you want the first press, those are the virgin or extra virgin.
Okay.
And if it just says pure, right, that's second,
Second press.
third, heat pressed. That's
Okay.
why some of it'll say cold pressed, cause that's
Yep.
the Old Testament, you just squish.
right,
But if you
That's
heat it
why
up,
there's such a
you're gonna
difference
get
in
more
price.
oil out.
Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
there's such a difference in price.
That's
When you
why the
look
one
at
is
olive oil,
$20 and the
you
other's
look at the extra
$8.99.
virgin, it's like,
yeah,
why is that so much more expensive?
Right.
Because the first pressing is the best as far as flavor. And so, they
Yep.
charge more for that, and then you
Right.
just keep trickling, you get to the light olive oil, and
Right.
it's just like, yeah, we're about to the fourth pressing, and
yep.
It's
So,
like throwing more water over the coffee grounds to get,
squish it really hard to get the
Yeah,
last little
yeah,
bit
it's-
out, right?
Coffee,
Knows
but
to
it-
give me the coffee first before he does it.
That's because I love my wife.
So, yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting, kind of background knowledge there for the olives and the word Gethsemane. All right, so a few verses that are kind of unique to Matthew. Some little
to Matthew
information.
or to Mark.
Oh, that should have said Mark. Shoot, sorry. It's Mark. See, that's what you get when you do copy. and paste. So, all right, so anyways, just some little tidbits that Mark gives us. He is the only place where Jesus is actually referred to as a carpenter. Other places refer to him as the son of a carpenter. Mark actually refers to him as a carpenter. Now, the word there is actually the Greek word tekton, and I think we had talked about this in a study maybe last year or something, but tekton actually technically can mean a carpenter, like we think of a carpenter. It can also mean a woodworker or even a stonemason. And so we don't know 100% that he was a carpenter as in what we think of a carpenter. But he, his family could have been a stonemason, they could have been woodworkers. I think I even, saw something about brick one time in them. So anyways, but Mark is the only place where it actually says, and I have verse 3 there, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and are not his sisters with us? And they took offense at him. So he's the only place where Jesus is actually labeled as a carpenter.
Construction worker.
Yep, something in those trades, we know. Okay, so I thought it was also interesting, none of his 4 brothers, he has 4 named there, believed in him as their Savior during his ministry, but James and Jude did after his resurrection. James became a leader in the Jerusalem church and wrote the Epistle of James. So the book of James in the Bible is actually Jesus' brother James. And Judas wrote the Epistle of Jude. So 2 of our books were actually written by Jesus' half-brothers. The sisters are, we have no names, and we do not know specifically how many of them there were, but obviously plural, so 2 or more. And so that was kind of, just a little interesting side note there. And I think they are listed in one or more of the other Gospels, but again, Mark's the only one that refers to Jesus as a carpenter. In 438, we get a little extra detail that when he was out in the boat and he was apparently sleeping and the storm kicked up, he was sleeping on a cushion. So we know he was on a cushion in the boat. And in 439, he records Jesus saying, "Peace, be still," to the storm. So a couple details there. So this is, now we're going to get to where Mark includes a interpretation of Aramaic words that Jesus spoke. And again, because he's talking to Gentiles who won't necessarily know Aramaic, which was kind of the language of the Jews, then he gives this interpretation or meaning for that. So in 541, he says, and this is, you probably are familiar with this, taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." That was Jairus' daughter. And so he gives the Aramaic, and then he gives the meaning for it. In 734, this is Jesus healing someone, took him aside from the crowd privately, put his fingers in his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue, and looking to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." So again, gives the Aramaic, gives the meaning. And in 1534, this was, we're familiar with this, one of the words from the cross. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So again, he gives the Aramaic, and he gives the meaning of that. So that's unique to Mark. The one parable that Mark has that no other gospel has is the parable of the seed growing. And I bolded a little bit there. We sing a hymn near Thanksgiving. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain shall appear, is what our hymn verse says. And so that is actually taken from this very short parable that only Mark records, the parable of the seed growing. Then we have another interesting little thing that Mark records. This is the only place where it's recorded that Jesus' family, again, his actual family, tried to physically restrain him, which, again, I mean, we're familiar with the fact that his family wasn't really happy with what he was doing, and we're trying to get him to be quiet sometimes. But it's interesting, if you actually read this, he went home, the crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. Again, his family was kind of worried about what was going on. I mean, think about that. The crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. I mean, there was just so many people following him and, you know, kind of closing in that, like, they couldn't even eat because there were so many people. But it's interesting that his family was kind of going out to, like, physically restrain him, and so another little interesting thing Mark has. We talked about at the beginning that Mark shows kind of the human side of the Son of God, and so the emotional, he gives some information about, you know, the emotions of Christ, and in 10:14, he is the only one that records that Jesus was indignant toward the disciples because the disciples were not letting the kids come, and while that little thing is recorded in other Gospels, Mark is the one that says he was indignant. So Mark is, again, giving a little bit of, you know, just a little peek into the fact that, yes, Jesus was human and he had emotions. All right, so a couple familiar verses that are pretty unique to Matthew, and these are very familiar. 2:27.
Mark,
Oh, shoot, sorry. I'm gonna have to go fix that in my thing before I print more of these. 2:27, he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That is found only in Mark. In 10:9, we have heard this many, many times. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Every wedding that we hear that kind of follows our normal wedding literature or liturgy, that voice is read there. In 16:16, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. That is a verse, and again, there are similar things said in other Gospels, other books, but we are very familiar with this one, and this is found in Mark. 16:19, just a couple verses later. So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. That sat down at the right hand of God. Now, it is said in many other places and in many other things, but the fact that it's attached, or Mark wrote it attached to the ascension, that he sat down at the right hand of God, that is unique to Mark right there. All right, so the only kind of common icons I could find for Mark were a winged lion. And the one on the right, that's just not, he's just grumpy looking, isn't he?
yeah, I mean, I can barely see that, but yeah, I don't
Yeah,
like the one on the
he's
right.
kind of like, well, I don't think I want that hanging in my house. He doesn't look very happy there. But the winged lion, and so here's what I found, and again, I saw the same stuff in various different places, but this one website kind of had it nice and succinct right here. So St. Mark, represented by the winged lion, references the prophet Isaiah when he begins his gospel. Here begins the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In Isaiah the prophet it is written, I send my messenger before you to prepare your way, a herald's voice in the desert crying, make ready the way of the Lord, clear him a straight path. I'm not sure what verse or what version they're reading there. But if you flip back to the beginning of Mark, you will see that that's how he begins his gospel. He starts out with, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then he has the passage from Isaiah there. Actually, I think it's from Isaiah and I can't remember if it was Malachi or Micah, but it's kind of a combined passage there. So anyways, this voice, the voice in the desert crying reminds one of a lion's roar, so that's the lion. The prophetical spirit descending to earth reminds one of a winged message. I also saw that referenced to Isaiah as well, that the message is kind of a winged message from Isaiah. The lion also signified royalty, an appropriate symbol for the Son of God. So hence the winged lion. Yeah, I know. It's like, okay. So, I found the nicer one there on the left. Like I said, the one on the right, he's kind of grouchy looking, so, and we don't need any more grouchiness right now. So we'll go with the other one.
He looks like he's mad for being woke up.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So, all right. So that's Mark. We'll take Luke next week, and, we, just looking forward, how many more Sundays? We will be gone on the 19th of October, so we won't have Bible class that
So
day,
next week.
So next
and then
week?
Not the week after.
and not the week after, okay. So we'll have Luke next week, and then we'll be off for a week. So, all righty.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Going back to, Jesus' brothers,
Uh-huh.
maybe you said it before and I missed it. How do you know that they were his half-brothers?
If you, what verse is that?
6:3.
6:3. So. I did not bring my reading glasses either, Lois. So here we go. Okay, let's see if I can catch the 6:3 Carpenter. Okay, brothers. Okay, so this is telling me, see the note on Luke 8:19. Nobody else has their Lutheran Study Bible? Okay. Though none of these four brothers of Jesus believed in him as a savior during his earthly ministry, James and Jude did. James saw the resurrected Jesus, 1 Corinthians, became a leader in the Jerusalem church, and then gives a whole bunch of verses there. Wrote that. See page 2130. Okay, hold on, let me reference. So they're actually listed in more than one of the Gospels as his brothers. Let me see, Luke 8:19. Okay, so this says his brothers, and Luke 8:19 reads, "Then his mother and his brothers came to him, but they could not reach him because of the crowd. And he was told, 'Your mother and your brothers are standing outside, desiring to see you.' But he answered them, 'My mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it.'" So it says, probably refers to the natural children of Joseph and Mary, i.e. Jesus' younger half-brothers. However, there is a later tradition that Joseph was widowed before marrying the Virgin Mary. If that is so, these siblings would be his older stepbrothers, born to Joseph by his first wife. See note Mark 6:3, which is where we just were.
It just
So-
dawned on me, that was a stupid question.
No, it's good. But see, that's one of the reasons why the study Bibles are really nice, because it gives us, not only like some commentary, but it gives us parallel passages, and that's kind of what I spend a lot of my time doing when I'm prepping, is like reading the parallel passages. But, so it is, I don't think I've seen anything that questions that Jesus had like actual half-brothers and sisters. Like, that is very, very well, accepted that he did, so.
That's interesting that, I never really thought of the fact that he might have older half-brothers or
Possibly,
sisters.
yep.
I've always considered, when it mentions like brothers and sisters, I
Uh-huh.
always figured they were younger because they would be Joseph and Mary's. But yeah, the fact that Joseph could have been, because tradition holds, or.
That he was old.
That he was much older
Yeah.
than Mary was,
Yeah.
that he could have had a first wife
Right.
and other children.
Right, yeah.
Interesting concept.
Yep.
Learn something.
No, they're
Yep,
never,
yep.
there, I would think that there'd be something about them if they were older.
Right, yeah, and it's hard, that's something that you can dig through a lot of commentaries, and one of the things that that they look at in those commentaries, and again, you know, like Steve said last time, this is PhD stuff, you know, people write books on this stuff, but they go back and they look at early church tradition as well, like within the first couple hundred years after Jesus. So they're looking at those early church fathers, and these are extra biblical sources. So writers like Josephus and Plinius and like some of those other early church writers who are writing within a generation or a couple of generations of Jesus, they look back at those writings. While they might not have been eyewitnesses, there were still people alive at the time that were sources, and on the other side of that, people alive that could have corrected the falseness. And so they look at these early church writers and they say, well, you know, he mentions this. They cross-reference, you know, to see like, is it mentioned by multiple ones? Is it generally agreed upon? And that's one of the things too with the Gospels, because there are a lot of critics that say, you know, this gospel, you know, shouldn't be in canon or blah, blah, blah. But they're looking at that early church, what was accepted by them? Like, and so we're talking to people who knew Jesus or the next generation after that, you know, who would have known. And so, you know, they kind of look at not just what we have in Scripture, but what was accepted and utilized by the early church, and what was written again by these, you know, outside of the Bible sources, who are generally, you know, ascribed to be fairly good historians and pretty accurate. So, you know, so then these you know, you cross-reference all that stuff and look at what was accepted by them, and yeah, so.
Going back to Mark and thinking in terms of, you know, because he was not one of the original 12 disciples, but as you informed us earlier, you know, he very much followed Peter.
Right.
And what Peter said.
Yep.
I find it interesting that Peter didn't write the gospel himself, especially considering he wrote later.
He wrote a couple, yeah.
You know,
Letters.
short letters or you know, Bible books, and he traveled around with Paul a lot. Did he go on any of the missionary journeys with Paul, or only when like Paul was in Rome he hung out with him?
Nope, they did. He did. I found one source that was like, then these two went here, and these two went here, and these two went here, and that was like a spider web of confusion in my mind. But he did go with Paul and Barnabas a few times, and apparently then they were going into some other place that like could be dangerous or something, and Mark decided not to go, and that's why later on when Paul and Barnabas were going someplace else, Barnabas wanted to take Mark, and Paul said no.
Because he's a coward.
Well, there was like, I mean, that's what the commentary says, is that, you know, Mark kind of fell out of favor with Paul for a little while, but then we have evidence later on that Paul actually asked for him to specifically come, so we know that somehow got smoothed over, or, you know, maybe Mark grew in his, you know, his faith, his standing, I don't know, but, so yes, he did actually go with them on to some places, and he did go with Peter some places, and then fell out of favor, but apparently he spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, but then he was actually specifically called for by Paul when he was in Rome, so, yeah.
I like the fact, so in my mind, you know, growing up, because in my head, all the books of the Bible happen chronologically.
Right.
That was the thing that my mind, you know, went to. It seems like there's such a, you know, these were written by the apostles or those that were very close witnesses. And then Paul came so much later. But as we saw when we were doing the minor prophets too, that there was overlap in, you know, the time periods that the minor prophets were preaching to those that they spoke to. It's good to see that, like for Mark too, there was that overlap of, you know, Peter and Paul kind of coexisting in a similar time frame. And, you know, so anyway, it makes sense.
It's really interesting looking at all that time frame of we know, if you look at Paul's first journey and his second journey and his third journey, and then who else was going here and there and everywhere, and who was in Jerusalem, and like I said, it's like a spider web.
Yeah,
It's
when you
know,
get to
it's
those,
just spaghetti tangled
yeah,
with.
those epistles, we're
Right.
gonna need a whole, fold out sheet again
Yes.
of
Oh, yeah.
all those missionary
Yep.
journeys and who went
Yep.
where and,
Yeah, it's really, it's interesting, but it's complicated.
yeah.
And some of it's like, well, this is when we think this happened, and this is when we think, because they have to piece it together by, these little things little nuggets we have here and there in the Bible, so, there wasn't one record of this, then he went here, then he went here, like, they have to go back and piece all that together, and, yeah, it was interesting, but, I started reading a couple paragraphs, and I said, oh, I gotta put that aside and refocus on what I'm doing here, cause, yeah, so,
I got a couple comments.
sure.
They're both short. One of them is for everybody, to pray for Linda, who's getting an eye operation in Sioux Falls, I guess,
Okay.
coming up in a day or two. And this is for the young people here. Hi, young people. Notice that even with modern technology, how many of us depend on glasses? Yeah, and we're not wearing them just because they're cool, and fashionable as a group. Not that everybody here doesn't have really cool, fashionable glasses, but in Bible times, yeah, they did not have any of that. And nobody who was over 40 was writing anything, because
Yeah, they didn't have the ability to correct their vision.
they couldn't,
It's interesting
Yeah.
because one of the things in that the regular ESV Study Bible, one of the little notes that was at the bottom that I kind of looked at, it did say that blindness and poor eyesight was a huge problem in biblical times, and that's just
And
what he
how
said.
old-
Like, they didn't have the technology to correct that vision, and so yeah, there
And when
wouldn't
you're
be a
working
lot of
outside-
old scribes happening.
When you work
so.
out in the sun, I know they always double check me for, I think it's glaucoma, because I worked for 11 years for the post office and was
Oh, okay.
outside all day.
Yeah.
And you're talking desert, sun,
Right,
equator. I guess it's not the equator. But,
Yeah. Where they were, yeah.
where they
Yeah.
were. That's like every. Yeah, they didn't have sunglasses. They didn't have baseball hats. They just had turbans or whatever. I guess.
Right,
And everybody's Tertius wrote for me or Mark, write this down.
Yeah, yeah.
The old people then they weren't doing their own
Right.
writing because
Yep, yep. Have the young whippersnippers.
yeah, they had the younger happen to it.
So, yep.
Even if they were
I'll
younger.
remember to bring my reading glasses next time. Because, yeah, that writing is like, what did we decide, like 8 font or something in the bottom here? So,
Or you're gonna have to email it to me on my phone so I can make it
right,
like.
blow it up,
Yeah,
right?
make it-
Yeah. Oh, gosh. All righty, we'll see everybody next.
Phones to blow up the
I
font.
love study Bibles when it says the notes are in 6.
Yeah.